In this video, I'll discuss Phaco IOL utilizing a divide and conquer technique with vertical irrigation. When setting up, getting ready for your cataract, make sure you spread the lid speculum to the maximum opening. I make two paracenteses, one at 6 and one at 12, and I make these same paracenteses on every case so that I can find them later on if I need to. Irrigate the anterior chamber with 1% non-preserved xylocaine, being sure to fill the entire anterior chamber, and then fill with viscoelastic, starting from the far side to the near side to prevent aqueous pockets. The incision is made with the guarded diamond knife that's 600 microns. Push firmly on the cornea so you get some tactile feedback. The main incision is made in a triplane fashion, first going up with the keratome about halfway between the tip and the line, then raising the handle and going into the eye so as to make a triplane incision. I use the cystotome to begin my capsulotomy in the middle, and I push to form a flap, tearing counterclockwise. This gives me the most amount of residual capsule should I run into difficulties with my capsulotomy in the subincisional area, which can be very difficult to retrieve if you only have a small piece of capsule to work with. Utilizing small tearing circular motions and spinning the Utrata forceps in your fingers, the capsulotomy is continued. Once you get to the incision, reverse position and begin pushing with the Utrata forceps to continue the capsulotomy 360 degrees. The Chang cannula is introduced, burped outside the eye, inserted under the anterior capsule to about the limbus, and then with a steady stream of fluid the nucleus is hydrodissected and then spun. Try to irrigate slightly into the anterior chamber to deepen it before removing the Chang cannula. This makes insertion of the phacoemulsification handpiece easier. The handpiece is then introduced into the anterior chamber, and then I phacoemulsify the anterior cortex just inside the capsulotomy. This gives me a landmark later on in the case when the capsular edges may be difficult to visualize. A groove is then made as far as you can comfortably see, 2 tips wide and as straight-sided as you can make it. By making the groove a U-shaped channel with a flat bottom will greatly facilitate cracking the nucleus. The Koch spatula is then inverted, placed at the bottom of the groove, as is the phaco tip, and gently pushing downward and outward, the nucleus is cracked. The nuclear fragments are then dialed so that the groove is horizontal, and a second groove is made in the far heminucleus, similar to the initial groove, 2 tips wide with a flat bottom, and those quadrants are then cracked again with slightly downward and outward pressure. Note at this point that the phacoemulsification handpiece is turned so the irrigation is vertical. The nuclear edges then can be elevated and the quadrant phacoemulsified without much need for a second instrument. Notice that the Koch spatula is well out of the field of play and not interfering with the nuclear fragment travel to the phaco tip. The final heminucleus is rotated, the wall of that groove is then captured, and the heminucleus is likewise phacoemulsified. And as you'll notice, the nuclear fragments all want to travel to the phaco tip if you have vertical irrigation. Notice how far the posterior capsule remains away from the phacoemulsification handpiece as this proceeds. The bimanual irrigation aspiration handpieces are then introduced with the irrigation introduced first, and with gentle aspiration under the capsule, which is increased as the cortical material is brought to the center so as to be able to strip the cortex from the capsular bag. This is continued for as long as the cortex is easily accessible, and then the instruments are reversed. Again, irrigation goes in first, the aspiration cannula, gently grabbing the cortical fragments underneath the capsule and increasing vacuum as traction is continued across the anterior chamber. Residual cortex can be removed by gentle aspiration across the posterior capsule, or if they're adherent, gentle scraping with the irrigation portion of the bimanual cannula with irrigation going. Next, viscoelastic is placed to inflate the capsular bag. The cannula is placed underneath the level of the anterior capsulotomy and gently inflated. The Sanger sweep can be used to remove residual epithelial cells on the underside of the anterior capsule. Gentle upward traction on one side and the other generally loosens these without a problem. Finally, the lens is introduced. The eye is stabilized with the Sinskey hook with the tip facing away to avoid endothelial damage, and the inserter is inserted into the anterior chamber, and the lens is injected within the capsular bag. Notice as the lens is in position with additional extension of the obturator, the sleeve is pulled backwards so as to avoid undue pressure on the lens. Utilizing the Sinskey hook, the lens is centered within the capsular bag, the haptics are separated from the optic, and then finally the anterior capsule should be located over each of the haptic-optic junctions to ensure that the lens is within the bag. Finally, the residual viscoelastic and epithelial cell material is removed with the irrigation aspiration handpiece. It can be useful to aspirate behind the lens itself to make sure that we don't have any retained viscoelastic material in the retrolental space. Any viscoelastic left behind at this point can cause an intraocular pressure rise on the first postoperative day. Finally, the angled 30-gauge cannula is used to hydrate the wounds. First, the wound edges are hydrated, and then the cannula can be turned horizontally to hydrate the roof of each of the incisions so as to achieve water tightness. Finally, the intraocular pressure is checked with the butt end of a Weck and the wound burped or the anterior chamber inflated as necessary to achieve a good intraocular pressure. The wounds are then checked for water tightness with the edge of a Weck and as a final step in the procedure, 0.05 cc's of Vigamox is injected into the anterior chamber. The pressure is once again checked and water tightness is once again confirmed. And this concludes the case.